Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Come on out. Applause. Yay! This is the final of 4 conversations this week that ends an incredible year of Yesod. And for anyone who's interested in learning about the Hagim, next year we are doing 9 visits, 9 different places and teachers, and I hope you will look into it. Please silence your cell phones for the sake of our amazing panelists, who I will now introduce. Rabbi Ben Spratt, we can wave Ben so they know it's you, serves as Senior Rabbi of Congregation. We got some fans. Rodeph Sholom in New York City. Rabbi Spratt's Jewish journey moved through the Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Renewal, and Reform movements of Judaism before becoming ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary, JTS. He centers his rabbinate on the values of connection, collaboration, and belonging. Continuing the long legacy of innovation at Rodeph Sholom, Ben helps spark new initiatives to center on the needs of all people. Ben is a regular presence in written publications and podcasts, often with his co-author and colleague, Rabbi Josh Stanton. Together, they wrote a wonderful book, I had the privilege of interviewing them, called Awakenings, American Jewish Transformations in Identity, Leadership, and Belonging. And he holds a regular column for Religion News Service, exploring the changing landscape of American religion. Rabbi Elliot J. Cosgrove of Park Avenue Synagogue, is a leading voice in the conservative movement. He is the author of 15 collections of selected sermons, the editor of Jewish Theology in Our Time. A New Generation explores the foundations and future of Jewish belief. And his essays and op-eds appear frequently in a variety of Jewish publications. I send them around all the time, including the Jewish Week and the Forward. He is the author of the forthcoming book. It's called For Such a Time as This, on Being Jewish Today. He sits on the Chancellor's Cabinet of JTS and on the editorial board of Conservative Judaism, a member of the Executive Committee of the Rabbinical Assembly. He is also an officer of the New York Board of Rabbis, a member of the board of UJA Federation of New York, serves as Rabbinical Advisor on Interfaith Affairs for the ADL, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and serves on the Board of Trustees of Hillel at the University of Michigan, Go Blue, and on the National Board of Governors of Hillel at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome. Who's up first? Is it, I think, Elliot?
Thank you, Abby, and it's so nice to be here, and thank you for your leadership. I know you're moderating us, but your voice, your leadership of the New York Jewish community is so important, and it's an honor to be here, and it's great to be here and see familiar faces, see new faces, and especially to share this moment with my dear friend and colleague and powerhouse of a rabbi from a place called the West Side, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say. So it is June, which means it is wedding season, and I am meeting with lots of couples, and we go over the chuppah, how many times someone's circling this person or that person, what we say, what we do. Inevitably, the issue of vows come up. And aside from the mandated one line as one ring is put on one spouse's partner, the question of personal vows always comes up. Do they or don't they want to exchange personal vows? I have no dog in this fight, but it's always interesting to see what the couple decides to do. But I do always caution them that when they are in my office, this young couple, if they are crazy enough to get married, crazy enough in love one with the other to tie their destinies together, I always say there's simply no way that they are going to fit into a 3x5 card the enormity of what they feel about each other, or even a 5x7 card. And I say, to love someone is to love them with the fullness of your being. And at a certain point, words themselves fail. And at a certain point, as I've discovered, the vows people make are actually more about them than the other person. And I realize that no matter how close, now 25 years into being married to my own beautiful wife, you may feel to another, there's always going to be distance, something unknowable about the person with whom you're in a covenantal relationship. It's disorienting. It's also what makes loving fun, as Fleetwood Mac said. To be in covenantal relationship with that which is ultimately unknowable. So I offer this template of human love to speak about God, because the project of theology, if you will, is a project of trying to put into our 3x5 card that which is ultimately unknowable, that which ultimately words fail, that which ultimately says more about us than it does about any certainty that we might have about the divine way. And the project of faith is an expression of that love we have not for another person, but for a God to whom we draw close to, but is always ultimately unknowable. And so, with the theme of today of being in dialogue on putting more God in our lives, I want to frame 3 texts that are powerful and meaningful to me, and that we'll put in conversation with Rabbi Spratt's texts that speak to this unknowability of God, and then we'll enter into a dialogue on it. So everyone, let's take out our sheets in front of us. And I think Rabbi Spratt's are before mine, so if you flip the page to where it says Cosgrove.
Don't hesitate to read them.
Okay. And if people are watching from afar, this first scene takes us to one of the darkest moments of the biblical record, the moment of the golden calf. The children of Israel have betrayed Moses and God by way of building a golden calf. God has punished Israel. The relationship is frayed, and Moses is standing in the breach, trying to mend this relationship between God and Israel. And in this raw moment, Moses begs of God to see the divine countenance. And in Exodus chapter 33, we read this at Ki Tisa, but it's also read at other points in the Jewish year. And Hashem said to Moses, I will do this thing. I will show you that which you have asked, because you, Moses, have gained my favor, for I have singled you out by name. And he, meaning Moses, says, Oh, let me behold your presence. Hareini na et kevodecha. And God answered, I will make my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name of God and the grace that I grant and the compassion that I show. But you cannot see my face, for a human being may not see me and live. And then something very curious and mystical happens, and God says, See, there is a place near me. Station yourself on the rock, and as my presence passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock and shield you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. So it's very strange, this yoga eclipse, right? We put on our glasses, we can sense God, we can't see God. There's a sort of asymptotic nature to this we aspire towards, but can never actually arrive at approaching God's presence. And if Moses, the greatest prophet of all, can't experience God directly, then how much more so we mortals will never be able to put words to fully describe God. And we might be able, as a Mishnaic text says, to act in God's ways. God feeds the hungry, God clothes the naked, God supports the poor. We can act in godly ways, but we can never fully approximate God in the divine totality. And this has really been the story of the Jewish people ever since this moment. However, we need God. We need, as the title of today's session is named, putting God in our lives. Because if kashrut lacks any divinity, commanding voice, well, then it's really just a dietary choice equal amongst other dietary choices. If circumcision doesn't have a sense of covenant to it, then it's an objectionable and perhaps barbaric act. So, and I could go through all of the mitzvot. And so that need to feel God's presence, even if we can't say with certainty what God's presence is, remains our task at hand. And so the second text is a text by one of my heroes, Mordechai Kaplan, who says, to this day, he lived about 1880 to 1980. He probably wrote this in the late 1920s. To this day, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, there is no intellectually formulated conception which has acquired authoritative recognition in Judaism as the only true idea of God. The inevitable conclusion to which we are led by the consideration of the God idea in the history of the Jewish people and of the part played by it in civilization in general is that the Jewish civilization cannot survive without the God idea as an integral part of it, but it is in no need of having any specific formulation of that idea authoritative for all Jews. So there are two statements he's making here. Number one, without God, there is no Judaism. But notice Kaplan says the God idea. Kaplan himself didn't believe in a supernatural God, but the notion of the divine, and we can talk about this perhaps in the discussion of what Kaplan did or didn't mean. But he goes on to say that there's no specific formulation. God in the Garden of Eden is walking with Adam and Eve. God is a central character in the book of Genesis, but by the end of the book of Genesis, God is appearing in Joseph's dreams. God is with an outstretched and mighty hand with Moses. God is in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, in the wilderness wanderings. God takes on different formulations throughout the biblical text, and all the more so through rabbinic literature, through Maimonides, through Kabbalah. There is no specific formulation. The Jewish tradition is internally elastic and pluralistic when it comes to conceptions of God. If you tell me God is a spirit, I can find you a text to do that. If you describe God in anthropomorphic ways, I can give you a text that explains that. This is very frustrating because unlike other faith traditions, we don't have a catechism where we check a box of what God is or isn't. On the other hand, it's incredibly liberating because we have all sorts of texts describing God's presence in our predecessors' lives that speak to our own moment. The last text, and I'm out of time, is Pesikta de Rav Kahana, the third text. This is in anticipation of the festival of Shavuot that is coming up next week. The very first lines of the giving of the Torah is, I am the Lord your God. The rabbis pick up on a curiosity of the text. God was speaking to 600,000, perhaps 3 million if you count the women and the children, people. What would you expect? I am the Lord your God, singular, or I am the Lord your God, plural? Well, it's written, Anochi Hashem Elohecha, singular. And so the rabbis say, why? It should be written in the plural. God's addressing the entire nation of Israel. And Rabbi Hanina Bar Papa says, the Holy One appeared to Israel with a stern face, with I can't pronounce that word, equanimous face, meaning a moderate face, with a friendly face. Let's turn the page. With a joyous face, with a severe face, appropriate for teaching of Scripture. And it goes on to say, when a person teaches Torah to a child, impress upon their own awe, and then with an equanimous face appropriate for the teaching of Mishnah, with a friendly face appropriate for the teaching of Talmud, with a joyous face appropriate for the teaching of Agadah. Therefore the Holy One said, even though you see me in all these guises, right, I am the Lord your God. God appeared to them as a statue with faces on every side, that though thousands might be looking at the statue, they would be led to believe that it was looking at each one. So too, when the Holy One spoke, each and every person in Israel would say, the divine word is addressing me. That is why it says, I am the Lord. It doesn't say I am the Lord your God, but it says I am the Lord thy God in singular. Right? So we've all seen these paintings on a wall where wherever you stand, it freaks me out. It's like they're looking right at you. But it's saying this is how God operates. That everybody heard the voice of Sinai as if you were being addressed. And that is the miracle of revelation at Mount Sinai, and that is the nature of God's presence. That God appears sometimes joyously, sometimes in a stern way, sometimes in other guises, but Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That not just the Jewish tradition, but the plurality of God's presence is felt within all of tradition. And the final word I'll share with you is simply on a pastoral level, and perhaps we'll get into this, that it's not simply in texts, it's also in the context of being a rabbi. The God that I preach on Yom Kippur is different than the God when I'm in a hospital room with a congregant. The God at a joyous occasion is different than the God at graveside. And while this may appear to be internally inconsistent, I feel very privileged to be the teacher of a tradition that has this reservoir of resources to speak about God that speaks to the manifold chapters of our lives. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, Rabbi Ben Spratt. This is not a debate. This is just additive.
First of all, I just want to, again, offer gratitude. It is humbling and exciting to get to be in dialogue with two of the great luminaries and leaders of our generation. So really, this is an honor. So I wanted to actually start with a story. This is a story from the 18th century that comes from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. There was once a king that had such legendary wisdom that everyone in the world wanted to go and seek presence and counsel from this king. And so the king built a palace, a castle filled with walls and partitions and gates. And anyone who would come would meet the outer gate and would be presented with two options. Either you can try to make your way through the maze of the gate, or here's some treasure, and why don't you take this instead and go on your way. And the reward would increase as people went further and further into the castle. As you can imagine, many of the pilgrims and petitioners to the king ended up finding themselves their wants satisfied by the treasure and would turn and walk back to their homes. But the few decided to go all the way into the inner chamber of the palace. And there, as though there was a veil that was lifted from their eyes, they came to see that the partitions and the walls and the gates were all an illusion, that the king was the entire castle palace itself. So I use this as a frame because for many of us, the question of theology is the basic question of do you or don't you believe in God, which in my opinion is the least interesting question in the realm of theology, maybe one of the least interesting questions in all of religion. And so the question then becomes, what is the real quest for God all about? And for me at least, theology is at its best when it challenges us to delve deeply into our lived experience in our world, to see a connection and a connectedness that we might have not noticed before. And theology is at its worst when it becomes a tool with which we can divide the world and the way which we might use it almost like a cudgel to create separation, distinction, and abandoning people and the world around us. And so I would say that for some of us, the quest for God is something that we will do in a shallow way. We'll be easily distracted by the simple, sparkly thing, the wonderful, pithy quote we once heard, and let that be the abandonment of our quest, and miss the entire purpose altogether. And then for some of us, we go and look at the project of God belief, and we see the way in which God has been used as a tool to justify the greatest acts of inhumanity. And we come to believe that God belief is simply for the ignorant and the malevolent. But I wonder if we might be more like those few pilgrims willing to actually go through the difficulty of going through the gates, to not be distracted, and imagine what we might find at the end of it. So to paraphrase William James, a person's theology is always inherently connected to their psychology, much as Rabbi Cosgrove acknowledged that, the God in the hospital room is different than maybe the God of Yom Kippur. The different experiences we have as individuals and as a collective changes the way that we think of how we knit the world and make sense of our relationship with it. And I think it's interesting, especially in Judaism, that times where we have the greatest explosions of theological thought have always come in the aftermath of great rupture and fragmentation in our world. If we think back to the destruction of the temple and the creation of exile and the dispersion of Jews around the world created the bloom of rabbinic theology and thought, how to make sense of a world that could no longer be seen as centralized and somehow to find the sacred in any space and in any text. With the rise of the Spanish Inquisition, and we get to see the emergence then of the bloom of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism to try to believe that beneath the horrors of the surface layer of reality, there is some power and potency that we are tapped into, some greater purpose to all of this. And of course, in the wake of the Holocaust, we got to see the emergence of so many great Jewish theologians trying to make sense of, at least in the context of Judaism, the most horrific chapter of our history. And going back to the Baal Shem Tov, the author of the story that I started at the beginning with, the Baal Shem Tov was starting the Hasidic movement in the wake of pogroms and poverty in Eastern Europe. And so this brings me to this question of this particular moment, a fracture and rupture in our world. In this post-October 7th world, I'm grateful to be joining my beloved colleagues here, exploring, I think, one of the great questions of this time, which is, what is faith? What is the best of theology that could actually galvanize us in this moment of our existence? And over these past 8 months, the text that I have spent the most time sitting in and struggling with is actually a text that was written by Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg in 1977, as he was trying to talk about the necessity of theology in a post-Holocaust world. And so I'm going to bring this forward, and I just want to warn you, this is a brutal, challenging, and unsettling text. To use catastrophe to uphold the univocal validity of any category is to turn it into grist for propaganda mills. The Nazis turned their Jewish victims into soap and fertilizer after they were dead. The same moral gorge rises at turning them into propaganda. The Holocaust offers us only dialectical moves and understandings, often moves that stretch our capacity to the limit and torment us with their irresolvable tensions. In a way, it is the only morally tenable way for survivors and those guilty of bystanding to live. Woe to those so at ease that they feel no guilt or tension. Often this is a sign of the death of the soul. Let us offer then, as a working principle, the following: no statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. Those words haunt me, both because of how the Holocaust was taught to me and how I often will elevate theology in the wake of catastrophe. And for Greenberg, his words, these become our litmus test of a viable worldview and a viable belief system. Are we willing to hold inherent tension? Horror and atrocity raise some of the most anguishing theological questions. These are the ones that we always ponder. Why do the innocent suffer? Where is justice to be found in this world? Where is God in violence? What is the purpose of faith if it fails to protect people? In Greenberg's words, anyone who stands with certainty, who stands in any univocal way, Anyone who exists without profound struggle in their sense of faith and morality following catastrophe has, in his words, allowed his soul to die. And perhaps, connected back to the earlier story, has abandoned the quest for God. Where was God on October 7th? Was God in the rage and brutality? Was God with the massacred and the butchered, the children and the elderly? Was God indifferent or weeping or vengeful? Where has God been since October 7th? With the hostages? With the soldiers? With the Gazans? What are the beliefs that help us understand this moment in our collective story? Where is God in the walls and fragmentation that we feel today? And so those words of Greenberg's chill me. How do we say something theological that is credible in the presence of burning children? Not just long ago, but burning children today. For me, I cannot fathom or have faith in a God who would sanction or remain indifferent to burning children. Which ultimately leads us to the question and quandary: is theology, is God belief enough? In the Holocaust, many would argue it was secularization, the absence of God, that led to such inhumanity. But we find today, in every side of this current war, God's name being invoked to justify the death of children. And so this leads me to the second text, which I have been struggling with. Written by Viktor Frankl just years after he was liberated. He went through 4 different concentration camps, and after the war, this is one of his reflections. This is the second text. Time and again, we watch and witness how repressed religion degenerates into superstition. In our century, a deified reason and megalomaniac technology are the repressive structures to which the religious feeling is sacrificed. If common values and meaning are to be found, another step must be taken. A step now, thousands of years after mankind developed monotheism, the belief in one God. Monotheism is not enough. It will not do. What we need is not only the belief in one God, but also the awareness of the one mankind, the awareness of the unity of humanity. I would call it monanthropism. And this, I think, is important, because as one who has been raised in a world and continues to believe in the oneness of God, we see it becomes very easy to say there is only one God, and my God is the right God, and my God likes what I do, and my God believes that I'm doing the right thing. And if you don't agree, it's because you have the wrong God. And so I can justify almost any behavior that feels in opposition to me, as long as I believe that the only thing that matters is one God, and I have it. But Frankl challenges to say that's not good enough, because monotheism doesn't inherently lead to morality if all we do is justify our own behaviors. What pushes us deeper into that palace to find the unity? It's to also believe that we are all connected. And we can think in history of the way in which holy war, crusades, jihad, the way that we have allowed God to justify the annihilation of others, allowed and justified for the burning of children. And Greenberg and Frankl say, those are not viable theologies. And this makes me think of a 5th century midrash. This is to be compared with people who are on a boat. And at one point in their journey, this is not the third text, so I'm going off script here, there's a person who goes and takes a drill and drills a hole under his seat. And all the people on the boat say, "What do you think you're doing? You're going to sink us all." And the person said, "Why do you care? I'm drilling under my seat. I'm not doing anything under your seat." And this 5th century midrash, I think, is getting to Frankl's point, is that if we spend all our time arguing over who is the one who put the hole in the boat, or whose job is it to fix the hole, or who's taking care and protecting there's nothing under my seat, if we fail to ask the question, where is this boat heading, we end up sinking. And this, I think, is part of why theology becomes so important, because it pushes us to see and believe in something that we can't always notice. And maybe even more important, connected to Rabbi Cosgrove's notion, is that we have to continue that quest. So if I can link back to the way that Rabbi Cosgrove started, thinking about love for a second, out of curiosity, how many of you believe in love? Raise your hand if you believe in love. It's wonderful, okay? How many of you believe that you have the only definition of love that is reasonable in the world? Well, that's disappointing, okay? out of curiosity, how many of you believe that you could prove love to me? Wonderful. Wonderful. Excellent. Be bold. Okay, good. How many of you believe that you could package love and hand it to me? Wonderful. If you think about it, you could probably figure out a way to do it. But if we really get into it, we find that actually with love, we can only experience the aftermath, the expression of it. We can't actually see it full on. We can feel it, we can experience it, we can describe around it, but it's not the kind of thing that we can simply just hand to a person. In some degree, we have to journey in quest to discover it for ourselves. We've had people in our lives that have tried to give us definitions of love, wondering sometimes, why haven't I found it? But it's the journey and the quest that ultimately propels us to deeper layers and understandings of it. How many of you believe in justice? How many of you believe in hope? Amazing. This is also very hopeful for me. What I love is that the most important concepts of our time are concepts that we can't see face on, but just like the story of the cleft, that we can see the aftermath. We can see the wake of justice. We can see the wake of love. We can see the wake of hope. We can see these after expressions, but knowing that the concept and the feeling is something that's deeper beneath all of those things. And this leads me then to the third text, which is why I think the question of God and God belief is so important. If you go to that third text here, this is what happens a few verses after what Rabbi Cosgrove started us with. So Adonai came down in a cloud and stood with Moses there, proclaiming the name Adonai. Adonai passed before Moses, standing there in the cleft of the rock, and proclaimed a text that many of us in the high holidays are familiar with. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun. Adonai, Adonai, God is compassion and grace, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, and so on and so forth. The 13 attributes, we say. Many of us spend our theological journey focusing in on the subject of that statement, God. But I wonder, drawing on the wisdom of Mordecai Kaplan, if it's better for us to focus on the predicate for a moment. What gives us belief in love? What gives us belief in hope and in justice? It's a willingness to engage in our world and see patterns that point to something deeper. All of us have times where we struggle to feel the love, feel the hope, feel the justice. My question is, if we don't have a unifying call, a unifying belief that says to us we are all in this boat together, if we don't have a belief that suggests that there is something that threads through this entire world, if we don't have something that unifies the love and the justice, the hope and the dream, I wonder towards what do we reach and how do we cohere at a time of fragmentation? And so for me, I think this text that Rabbi Cosgrove started us with is exactly the right one. Is whatever cleft we may have hidden ourselves in, are we still willing to lift our eyes to see perhaps the surface of things bigger than ourselves that point towards a deeper unity and engage in the difficult and profound quest of seeing how all of this ultimately is God?
Wow. Truly incredible. And the fact that they're coordinated in their suits feels like God is here. So not to take the pressure off of me, but I want to remind people that I did not see these remarks in advance. So I'm reacting very much as the every Jew here. And so many thoughts are in my head. I just want to start with a few definitions because I don't want to pin you down when you've all just spoken about how this is actually the antithesis of God, is to try to narrow the definition. But I guess I want to understand what you each define as having faith. And maybe I start with you, Elliot.
The willed choice, can you hear me? The willed choice to believe in God. Meaning one can be an ethical, moral, upstanding citizen and opt outright. Atheism doesn't bother me conceptually, but faced with the mysteries of the universe, faced with the question of what defines a moral life, faced with the questions of what my place in this universe is, I have made the willed choice to wrestle with those issues or dance with those issues with the best dance partner of all, God.
And can I ask, if someone, and I'm sure many have, come to you and say they don't have faith, do you feel like they're missing something? I mean, do you feel like, not that you want to proselytize, but that you want to talk to them about what they might be missing without it?
I don't think there's anything defective about someone who doesn't believe in God. I think, as Rabbi Spratt pointed out, God has an awful lot of explaining to do, right? And so I think that a reasonable, terrific, soulful person can live without God. I think of survivors of the Shoah. Some people turned to faith, some people turned away from faith. That might have been questions implanted in them early, that might have been as a result of their experiences in the Shoah, but I don't see it as my job to convince or force people. And God is also not a proposition. It's not a math equation. It's not, right? I can live by example as to what it means to live in the company of God. I can, as Rabbi Spratt so eloquently described, talk about how to see in sort of a Hegelian way the presence of God and to instantiate God's presence in this world. But God is not something that I as a non-fundamentalist, do not believe it's my role to draw lines of in and out, and those who don't believe are out.
And before I get to Ben on this, I just want to push you a little bit on, I think what I'm trying to get at, I guess, and I appreciate that you're not judging in any way, but do you feel personally like when someone comes to me and says, the Torah is just, it's boring. I don't get these words. I don't get these stories. It doesn't do it for me. I kind of feel like, well, you haven't had the right teacher. You haven't had that right Havruta, study partner. It's more like you're missing this great meal. So I guess without reducing God, I guess that's part of what I'm asking is, do you sort of say there's something else that you could be experiencing that you're not without faith? That one is experiencing is missing without faith?
I'm not dodging your question. I just want to answer it honestly. I don't wag my finger, right? I play offense, not defense. And so if I'm trying to convince someone of why Torah study is important, why kashrut is important, why Shabbat elevates the human experience, why belief in God is this is crass to say it this way, but a value added to my spiritual existence that I show, I don't tell.
Okay. Ben, how would you describe having faith or define it?
So I'm going to take a rabbinic move and kind of back my way back into it.
Okay.
It's interesting. I get asked fairly often, actually, as people find out that I'm kind of in my background, kind of more of a science super geek. And, people often ask, like, Ben, do you really believe in God? I mean, really? And I'll always respond and say, well, what do you mean by God? And if people won't answer the question of what they mean by God, I'll always say, well, I don't believe in God, but what I believe in, I call God. Because for me, when I hear that word,
Can you say that slower? What you believe in, you call God.
Yes. So, because when I hear the word God, I think of Zeus. I think of an old bearded man in the sky with a lightning bolt ready to zap me. For whatever reason, that's still to this day, when I hear that word, that three-letter word, that's what comes to mind. It's part of why I really appreciate a Jewish heritage and a Jewish wisdom tradition that has thousands of names for God, because it destabilizes me from that kind of concept. And for me, I believe that faith is ultimately less whether one needs to have that word mean something, and more to what degree do you believe that you are connected and a part of something larger than yourself. So if I hear a person who says they believe in society, for me that takes faith. If I hear a person says they believe in democracy, I think that takes faith. If a person believes in love or hope, And I'm less interested, actually, similar to Rabbi Cosgrove. I'm not here needing for people to use a particular name for God. But I do think that all of us need to feel some sense of purpose in life, need to feel that we aren't alone in this world. And while I can't prove that to people, I can't force people into that, I do want to sit with people who struggle with the feeling that they're completely disconnected, that they're people who believe that their actions, their behaviors have no ripple effects in the world. But if you believe that you can affect others, and you believe that others can affect you, if you believe that the world can change you and that you can change the world, you are believing in a pattern and a behavior, a ripple, a tapestry that for me points towards what I call faith. Some people would say that's a duck. I happen to be joining Rabbi Cosgrove and being a huge fan of Mordecai Kaplan, and I would say, his theology was like a transnatural theology. We have to look at the patterns, the behaviors, the experiences of this world, and people coming together and moving the world forward. I actually feel like sometimes what is the biggest problem with faith is we get so caught up in the vocabulary that we, again, abandon the entire enterprise. So for me, God is just the boat in the metaphor that I used before.
You're also really talking about our agency because of God or because of faith, like what we choose to do or not do. And I want to, I guess, ask you about God, the idea of God as being there for us, protecting us, kind of walking with us. Those are ideas that are all through our Jewish liturgy. And maybe you don't believe in them, but it's not passive, but it's like, where's God showing up for me? How does that fit in to what you're describing?
For me, I believe it deeply. For me, I can look at so many moments in my life where things could have gone in 1,000 directions. Now, when I was a young child, I actually got run over by a car across my legs, and I couldn't walk for 3 weeks. And again, some people will go and say, okay, well, Ben, wonderful. You had a body that was flexible when you were a child. Your bones were a little bit nimble, and wonderful. You were able to heal. For me, I think about the million different variations that story could have gone. And for me, God is the one who heals. God is the one who allowed a person to stand up upright. When I think about my daily morning blessings, I can think of examples in my life all the time. Now, for me, I don't believe in a singular bearded man up in the sky who has said, I think that Ben specifically needs to go and be healed, but I'm connected to a universe of energies, of circumstances that I can go and attribute as being flukes, but those flukes are the things that create paradigm shifts in the world. And that to me is a lot about how we choose to tell the story. Do we choose to tell that as a story of a miracle, or choose to tell the story of it being a random occurrence that has no meaning? In my personal lived experience, it has a great deal of meaning. And that's just about to what degree am I willing to say, I'm a part of a larger cosmos, and I don't get to control all the variables. So when things go my way or don't go my way, I have to be able to feel some sense of humility of being a part of a larger enterprise.
Elliot, thank you. The fact that Moses wants to see God, how would you unpack that moment? Why the desire? Is that a given why Moses has that impulse? Of all things?
Yeah, I think there's something very human about it. I think there's a desire to know that which is unknowable. There's something aspirational about it, right? Anyone who's ever asked that question of why, right, yes, there's an anthropomorphism, I want to see God's face, but what's really happening there is I want to understand the will of God. I want to understand how decisions, right? We want to see behind the curtain. And God says, but we all want to be able to turn to the back of the book and see the answers in the question. It's just that we're mere mortals.
And why
right?
does God say no?
Because it's none of your BI button in business, right? It's
like
the last. It's the last chapter of the book of Job, when Job has been afflicted with all sorts of suffering, and all of Job's friends come up to him and say, well, maybe it's because you didn't wrap tefillin, or maybe because it's this, or maybe because you should have thought twice before you had that lobster bisque. And all of a sudden, right, we know the image, God comes out of the whirlwind and says, wait a second, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, right? Where were you when I set the Leviathan in the seas? you have no idea what you're talking. Job, that's not for you, right? Alexander Pope wrote a beautiful essay called Essay on Man, where he sort of says, what audacity do human beings have to presume to know the divine will? And so I think that sort of push and pull of course, we want to know the divine will, but we're never going to know the divine will. I think that's the human condition.
And when you have people say to you, where is God right now? It feels like God disappeared from me. Whether someone's facing a terrible illness or a child's death or looking at October 7th. I know it's unfair. I'm not so much talking about why bad things happen to good people, but that question of like, God seems to have disappeared.
So I think humility is the answer, right? I shudder at pat answers, whether it's a personal tragedy or a global tragedy, whether it's a human-inflicted horror like the Holocaust, or whether it's where is God in a tsunami. I think, the nature of evil might differ in scope and cause, but there is something unknowable about it. And I think I find it objectionable when I hear religious leaders explain trauma as the result of human misdeeds. And I find from a pastoral level, right, at the end of the day, we're both congregational rabbis. I was on the phone with someone who received a very earth-shattering diagnosis earlier today, and my answer is not to explain. My answer is to be present with that person. And so my answer is that I sit in the unknowing. And there's a beautiful text in the tradition of Imo Anochi Betzara that maybe the best we can do at that moment is to believe that God is with us there in our suffering.
Ben?
This is not going to be so exciting because I'm not going to disagree with him. I actually very much agree. But maybe
Come on.
I know. I'll see if I can add another facet, but it really is in agreement. Because again, I think, and this goes back a little bit to the Greenberg text, is I think when we feel that we are in a place of certainty, we have lost our way. And I think that's part of what I find so helpful about Jewish theology is I think that there's an inherent destabilization in Judaism when it comes to theology, because every theology you've ever heard from any religion in any era we have within Judaism, every single one. And that, I think, challenges anyone who believes, I have achieved the truth. I have seen the face of God, and I'm going to tell you how God is expressed in this world. But I think about one of the frames that Heschel brings. Heschel had a really interesting take on the beginning of Genesis. That when God says, Lo tov heyot adam levado, it's not good for a person, and in the context of this, I'll say a being to be alone. That was the first commandment, is the way that Heschel reads it. And that the first sin was when Adam chooses to hide from God in the garden, and God calls out, Ayeka, where are you? And it prompts, Heschel and his theology that God is constantly searching for us. It is actually in those moments, the feelings of solitude, in the feelings of abandonment, that we actually feel that connection with God. And actually, my beloved friend and colleague, Cantor Shana Delo here, we did a reflection actually on a teaching a number of years ago, passage in the Torah where God says, I am a resident stranger. You shall be like a resident stranger with me, imadi. And it creates this idea that God is the resident stranger. God is the one who both belongs and stands on the margins. And when we find those moments of marginalization, it is also in many ways, that is the place where God is most present. Where does God appear to the prophets? Where does God find the people? It's in the wilderness of the world. It's in the dreams of solitude. You think of Jacob, in such a destitute place in life, he's using a rock as a pillow, and that's where he finds God. And for those of us who have those moments of pain, I'm never going to be the one who's going to be the one to say to them, hey, here's where God is for you. But more to help them feel heard and accompanied, to feel like there is another being in this world that reminds them they're not alone in this. And ultimately, in that feeling, perhaps they may come to find and realize there is a bigger connection out there. Maybe like Jacob, maybe like Moses, maybe like so many others in our history. That may be the very conduit through which they find not only their faith, but their feeling of belonging.
Since you brought the Yitz Greenberg text, I wanted to just read something that he said in an interview with me about losing his son, JJ. At 36, he was hit by a car. To those who don't know, a remarkable young man riding a bike in Israel. He had said that he told me that he changed JJ's name. Can you first explain, when JJ was in the hospital and they were hoping for a miracle, what is the tradition of doing that?
So this is, and I'm sure Rabbi Cosgrove can articulate better than I can, but a long-standing tradition in Judaism and a tension of to what degree do we want to place death into the hands of God, and to what degree do we want to externalize this? So if you look at the text in the Torah on the final plague in the biblical in the Passover story, was it the angel of death or was it God? And depending on which text you look in the Torah, you'll find a different answer. As a way of acknowledging, one of the traditions is when you feel that death is pursuing you, the angel of death is pursuing you, one of the things that you can do is try to change your name as a way of confusing that angel of death, and in some ways bucking the destiny or maybe even the fate or the judgment that was laid out for you.
And he said that part of his faith was believing in the doctors, that God was actually, that part of creation is that it has led to medicine and led to physicians. And I'm just going to read this one piece because it struck me. He said about changing JJ's name, of course it didn't help, but that's not the point. Emotionally, when all else is lost, what can you do? The doctors were very honest, and I realized at this point the chances were not very good. But there is something profoundly attractive and fulfilling in grasping at the straw to get a magical miracle that's going to save your son because you prayed or because you kept Shabbat, even though I knew myself that I didn't believe that anymore. I had come to understand that God established a natural order, and that is the miracle. Can you just reflect on that? Because I thought that was someone with tremendous faith also facing the unimaginable.
For me in my life, in the times when I have felt most afraid, most betrayed, most enraged, I want a simple story. Because in those moments when I feel most destabilized, I want a simple story that allows me to feel like this world of often chaos actually has some firm footing. And I think part of what Rabbi Greenberg is illustrating there actually is maybe the more daring theological move, which is to avoid the simple answer and instead to be able to believe this experience is woven into a much larger tapestry. And to write a story that says we are in this boat together, that my blessing is, and my presence and my gift of God is in the doctors, is in the medicine, is in the scientific inquiry, is in all the people who ask the questions to try to scratch beneath the surface of the lived human experience. And what it says is ultimately my blessings are dependent on so many other beings and experiences and choices. And that to me feels like the more sophisticated theological move. Not here's the bad guy or here's the one, I ate the lobster bisque. It is the more complicated sense of I'm a part of a tapestry. And that awe, that wonder of witnessing that to me is the more difficult, but I think the more helpful theological move for most people, certainly for me.
Elliot, the text you brought from Kaplan, I just want to understand it a little bit better than I did. Is he basically saying that God is a given, that we all kind of can't live without it, even though we're not going to agree on the definition? Can you just help it, kind of, what's the sort of foundation?
Well, for Judaism to exist, the God idea has to be a part of it.
Okay.
Right? And that from the Garden of Eden to the present day, there have been certain building blocks of what this thing called Judaism is about. The God idea is one of them. You take it away, it's no longer Judaism. I mean, this is Kaplan, I'm saying. The irony of it is Kaplan, who was deeply influenced by Dewey, and others had a naturalistic, he was there's a natural conception of God. There's a supernatural conception of God. Dissertations have been written as to whether Kaplan actually believed in a God in a supernatural way. I think that Kaplan believed in the God idea as a concept, but he didn't actually believe in a commanding voice, a God who's actually operating in any way in this universe. I thought he was a product of his age. I think that's what, I'm sitting here just to mix it up a little bit. Rabbi Ben, as I call you when we're speaking privately, do I believe in more of a God or less of a God than you? Right? Like, do you believe that God commands you to do things?
I do. I think it's, for me, not a voice, but I feel like the degree to which I feel my connectedness to the universe is I do feel commanded.
You don't.
No, I do. I was thinking I believe more in God than he does, but maybe I don't. But then in some things I was like, no, I don't believe what he just said. No, I do. I believe. This is a thing that I believe that I will never know God's will, but I am subjected to God's will all the same. Right? When I perform a mitzvah, I don't believe it in a Kaplanian way that this is just sort of a habit of the Jewish people, a dietary choice. I believe that I'm fulfilling a commandment, or as Heschel described, that it's when when the heavens and the earth touch. That's in the performance of a mitzvah, of a commandment, and I believe that. Whereas I won't ever know the answers. When I get on an airplane and I'm, I say like Tfilat Haderech, and I'll say like the prayer for safe arrival. It's interesting because my wife always looks at me and I'm like, don't you pray? And she says, no, I'm praying that the pilot has taken the continuing education class and that the whatever, my bag. And I'm like, we have two different kinds of faith here. Like, I'm truly reaching out to the heavens. And
when you say that when you're doing the mitzvot, it's tied to faith.
Yeah.
Do you think about if I was not Shabbat observant, if I broke Shabbat, that God will punish, that God will take a...
No.
So there's no toll in that sense. There's no kind of quid pro quo here?
That's a bridge, just speaking very honestly in Raleigh. I can't... the Greenberg, the passage you just quoted about him praying for his child, I do pray, right? When the person called me today after a terrible diagnosis, we prayed together. I don't know if God is going to answer those prayers or not, but that doesn't stop me from reciting that Mishaberach prayer with that person. And just the way I'm wired, I mean, this conversation is forcing me to give words to things that I feel, but I can't believe that, because someone didn't check their mezuzah or someone didn't check, put on tefillin, that somehow that quid pro quo is an answer to either why bad things happen to good people or why good things, it just doesn't. I think life is more complicated and mysterious than that.
As you describe that conversation that you had and how you chose to respond, I feel like God was in that conversation. And I'm not saying this to compliment you. I think that any of us, and I'm sure people out there feel this, we kind of need you clergy folk, to give us access. First of all, enable us to do what can feel like a little bit of an awkward, unnatural, sometimes crunchy thing. And that you sort of give us license to go to a different zone, sphere, whatever you want to call it, but also that we kind of can't always do it alone. And as I sit here, I feel like I'm very comforted listening to both of you and your prisms on the divine, but I'm not sure I could summon it without you. And I just wonder, maybe partly it's going to what you said about it's a different God at the graveside, at the bedside, under the chuppah. So I guess I'm asking a little bit of, are you aware that you're a conduit in a way? Ben, maybe you take a stab at that first.
So it's interesting. I think in rabbinic school, one of the texts...
You can hold this down so people... You're holding it like...
One of the texts, sorry. Like I'm drinking a soda or something. In rabbinic school, I remember one of the texts that we had to study was I think it was Jack Reamer's text, the idea of being a symbolic exemplar, very much recognizing that we are always standing for more than we intend, whether we want to or not. And we can try to deconstruct that as much as we want, but at the end of the day, we're still going to stand for a symbol of something. And I actually do think, I would like to see, personally, more Jewish clergy sitting in the language of faith, in the language of theology, in the language of God, not because it needs to be done from the place of certainty, but because it gives vocabulary and texture to help people grapple with the big questions in life, and also to feel comforted that in their questions, in their doubts, and their struggles, is actually a part of the theological quest. Not every faith tradition has that, but we certainly do in Judaism, and it's one of the more remarkable elements. Again, I want to just, affirm, I was grateful that Rabbi Cosgrove started with the text that he did, because if Moses, who has experienced revelation on Mount Sinai, nonetheless still has doubts, nonetheless is still hunting and searching, nonetheless still wanting more certainty, then I feel like that justifies all of us as well. And I've yet to meet a human being that doesn't have doubts about some element of this universe. And I do believe, for me, the role of a rabbi is not about giving the answers, but about supporting the journey in the quest. I can't jump people to the innermost palace gates, but I can say to people it's worth the journey. I can say, don't be distracted by the treasure. There's something more there. And the vocabulary that they will come at the end of it probably will be different than mine. And I probably will have things to learn. I'm sure this is true for Rabbi Cosgrove as well, as I have learned more theologically from others than I think I have probably taught to others. And that comes from the lived experience of people who see and experience connectedness in this world. So, we can have a fun contest over, who's more of a God believer. But for me, I feel God rippling in the universe all around me. And it's interesting because a lot of that is taught to me by the people that I serve.
Elliot.
Can I just add one thing? It might be saying the exact same thing the rabbi just said, but I'll say it anyway. I don't love the language of conduit, but I would say a rabbi, the rabbinic vocation in its purest form is to be the teacher of a tradition. And so we have, as you've gotten the sense from both of us, an anthology of different formulations of God in the biblical and rabbinic tradition. So a sound rabbinic education means producing rabbis, and now I think about it 25 years into this trade, who have the literacy and pastoral sensitivity to know which conception of God, what book am I pulling off the shelf? So at that moment that I'm, describing this morning with the congregant, what did that person need at that moment? Right? That person didn't need to hear who will live and who will die from the Yom Kippur liturgy. Right? That person needed to hear another text. But my congregation on Rosh Hashanah does want to hear, right? And so that takes a certain sort of EQ with Jewish IQ to know what that moment is. And thank God we have this literature that we're able to draw from. And so, I don't know.
Since you mentioned the Unatan Tokef, I just want to touch on it. I know it's kind of the most unfair liturgy to ask about God, but it is always very hard for many of us to square the idea that, number one, that God is judging us, especially in such a short time, there's going to be a verdict on whether we get another year, but also that these three things, if we do them, could change the outcome. And so I guess I just want to ask, maybe I'll start with you, Elliot, this idea that, there is some petitioning, there is some behavior, there's something you could do to change the outcome. but God is ultimately going to be the final word. Is that even like a framing that you engage, or do you think that it's too literal?
No, I'll tell you how I interpret it. It's a complicated prayer. It's a difficult prayer, but I think the most important, right? Who will live? Who will die? Mi yichyeu, mi yamut. The most important word there is who, right? We don't know from year to year, and it's actually difficult as it is for y'all to hear that prayer. It's very difficult for us as rabbis, because we look out at our congregations knowing, I won't point, but knowing this person is facing terminal illness. This person, and I know that everyone sitting in that room is not going to be in that room a year from now. So and I know that there's someone who's hearing that, mourning the loss of a loved one in the year gone by from some unspeakable loss. And so it's as raw as it comes. And so for me, that unknowing of who will live and who will die alerts me to the precariousness of life and therefore the preciousness of life. And so when I hear, and it's a little bit of wordsmithing, but if you have a bit of Hebrew, it's not too far of a stretch, that prayer, repentance, and charity don't avert the decree, right? Because that's ultimately up to, the big guy upstairs, but it softens the blow. And so at Roah, the wickedness of the decree. So we have the choice, fragile and uncertain as life is, how will we choose to spend the hot second that we are here on this earth?
Ben, the who will live and who will die prayer, and then we'll go to questions in a minute.
So just before I came in here, I was going to take a walk across Central Park, and it was quite humid. Decided I was going to take a cab, and I for whatever reason got off at 66th Street instead of 65th. And as I was getting out of the cab and walking down, there was a person walking down the sidewalk who dropped a wrapper on the sidewalk, and a person who was walking down the sidewalk in front of me, called out to the person, but went and picked it up and put it in the trash. And then a bike zipped by. And what immediately went through my head is, okay, what if that interaction hadn't happened? And this, if anyone had seen the movie Sliding Doors, all over the place, we get the reminder that small, tiny changes of choice and pattern can have massive ripple effects in our personal lives and our collective lives. And for me, the Unatan Tokef is a recognition of the lack of certainty we have, that it is ultimately all up to the big guy upstairs. But
not necessarily a guy.
Fine. The big woman upstairs, I would agree. Or maybe not so big. So whatever it may be. The notion, though, that we lift up this prayer as not simply just suggesting the response to this prayer is let's throw up our hands and give up because we have no control. It's actually the opposite. It is indeed to ask, what are the technologies, what are the tools that we have in order to be a part of this uncertain universe and our uncertain fate? And do I think that just by giving tzedakah, I have somehow changed whether or not I'm going to die tomorrow or not? I'm not sure. But believing that behavior is saying, I believe that I have the ability to affect the world around me. I believe that these acts of the language that I use, the feelings that I have, actually shows to what degree do I move in tandem with the universe or not. And if I can believe that, if I can gauge the behaviors of that, they're much like sliding doors. Maybe I'm the one who knows when to get on the train and when not. Maybe I'm the one who notices when there's the person who's sitting alone or the person who otherwise would be abandoned in the world, and I could be the one to reach out to them. So for me, that's what the Unatan Tokef is about. It's really, yes, having us see our own mortality, yes, feeling the heartbreak of not knowing who we're going to be with next year, but more importantly, I think to say to us, if we are going to have any effect on our fate, it has to begin through a repeated behavior of saying, this is a universe of connection, and that means I'm connected and a part of it.
So my last question to you, and I promise to open it, and I really do want to hear from everyone, is just the idea in your text about, Elliot, about thy very own God. I am the Lord thy God, thy very own God. The divine word spoke to each and every person according to their particular capacity. I love the sort of personal nature of that. The idea, like, there's some, you said purpose for each of us, but there's also a conversation we're entitled to with the divine. That's actually, there's a sense that God is going to talk to Elliot and Abby and Ben very differently. And so I guess I would love to just end here with just you reflecting on us feeling not overwhelmed by the idea of divine, which feels very remote and sometimes awesome and frightening and overwhelming, but having that personal, kind of still small voice, a quieter, more private conversation.
Look, I think it's nice to have a panel and talk about what we do and don't believe in and how we make sense of theology and square the circle of our lived reality and belief in an omniscient God. But that's not how God works, right? God is an intimate, private, personal relationship, perhaps the most intimate relationship we have. And for me, as I said earlier, it's not about telling, it's about showing, right? When I light Shabbat candles in my home, when I sit next to my child in synagogue, or open up a prayer book, or put on tefillin, or when I tuck my, now they're big, they don't get tucked in, but, and sing Shema to my child, right? That is developing a language by which a relationship with God can be constructed on their terms. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think that is, and my blessing for my biological children, but also the children of my congregation, is that I give them the tools and model an example by which they can create their own relationship with their God, which is my God, but perhaps a very different God.
Ben, do you want to say anything about the sort of the personal conversation?
Again, I think I really agree with Rabbi Cosgrove. There's a midrash that asks the question, why does God appear as a warrior at the Red Sea and as a wizened sage on Sinai, and later as a nursing mother in the prophets? And the answer being God appears in the way that people need in that moment. And I've loved that because it shows the rabbinic move that this is not a modern question. This is actually a very ancient question. And I think this idea that if we believe that God is more than a single concretized idea, then it means at any one moment, God could be expressing itself in an infinite number of ways to an infinite number of people, and we'd all be touching that same elephant, and we are made better by both having the space to believe and trust in the experience we're having and be curious about the experience somebody else is having. And I think that's where theology is at its best, when we feel that we get a broader picture of the world in both the pain and also in the hope, when we are willing to share the things that we believe. And that's a scary conversation. I don't know, maybe it's different in Park Avenue Synagogue, but at Rodeph Sholom, I don't hear very often people going up and being like, let's talk about God.
All the time.
I'm sure, okay? And I think it's interesting because if we took away that word and we were to use, again, some other larger, more ephemeral, more platonic idea, like love or hope or something, we'd be much more comfortable with it, and we would feel invigorated and probably wiser for it. And I think it's true with theology as well, is I am very curious to get to know more about Rabbi Cosgrove's God. I'm very curious to know about your God. And not because I think that one of us is right, but actually because I believe you have experiences and textures that are different than my own.
Yeah.
So,
thank you. All right, folks, applause. Amazing. Please Questions? Yes, we'll start there, Erica, and come down just a sec. And I hope they're questions, inquiry.
So religious Jews say the Amidah several times a day, 3 times a day. And in the prayers, there's always there goes, hear our prayer, listen to our voice. My question is anyone listening? B, we say this all the time, but we don't see results from it. And C, does it diminish the personal agency to effectuate change in one's life by relying on something so ephemeral?
What's your first name?
Hal.
Hi, Hal. That's a lot of questions. Good questions.
Sure, I'll tee it up and then you can slam it in. So,
Whatever you want.
Hal, thank you. I think it's a really good question. And this is going to be, I hope, a helpful response. There's a Talmudic text of a blind man who's walking at nighttime, and he's holding a torch. And the question is, why would a blind man be holding a torch, whether it's daytime or nighttime? And the answer being, he's holding the torch so that others can come and walk with him. And I think part of what's helpful in the behaviors of religion is many of us want to be able to, again, see God's face. We want to be able to say the words of the Amidah and see clearly that God is listening and be able to see the effects of that prayer. And again, much like the image of the palace, is I think many of us as children, we think of, I know myself, is I think about the cause and effect relationship of if I do something and I get something good out of it, I will keep doing that thing. And for many of us, still as adults, myself included, that's how we go through things. I wonder if we might think about this more as being, what is the purpose of lighting a torch in the darkness of uncertainty? What's the point of lifting up words of hope and praise and gratitude? Even if we don't always know that it's going to have the effect that we intend, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect. And so for me, that is where I come to. There are days where I feel God listening to me, and there are days when I don't. There are days when I feel like my verbal prayers, my sung prayers actually change the world around me, and there are days that I don't. But the behavior, I think, is important. And so for me, that's part of the purpose of religious ritual and behavior is it is to be the torchlighters. It is to be the one who's willing to do that, and if nothing else, it means I get community out of it. I get to hear other people's voices. I get to hear the anthem of generations before me that have said those words.
So I think we could have a whole nother session on what we're doing when we pray. I think sometimes I pray and I really want something to happen, like a vending machine in the sky, insert prayer here, receive effect there. And sometimes I pray because I see the words on the page, and whether it's for healing, whether it's for peace, and it's a prompt to inspire me to see the godly and actualize the world as it should be, not as it is. And sometimes my prayers are answered and sometimes they're not. Sometimes the people I vote for are elected, sometimes they're not, but I still have an obligation to vote. And as a Jew, I still have an obligation to pray. I think the act of, opening up a prayer book is far more interesting and complicated than expecting the words. Sometimes it's there to alert us of the gap between the world as it is and as it ought to be, and to inspire us to close that gap and to wrestle with that gap. So, yeah.
Great. And there's one there too, but first, we got you. And your name first.
My name is Barry. I think if you ask most people, or many people, if they believe in God, they might say no, because they believe that what you mean is the theistic God that is omnipotent and omnipresent and everything like that. You both mentioned Mordecai Kaplan. I've been studying Bible and Torah for about 25 years now, and I'm on my maybe third or fourth iteration about what I believe, what God I believe in. I think right now I'm a limited theist of Milton Steinberg, who was one of your predecessors. I guess what I'm wondering is to what extent you think it's important and are teaching different theologies and let people know that belief in God is a range, that you don't need to believe in the theistic God to be a good Jew and to believe to have a real belief in Judaism.
I try to talk the talk and walk the walk. I think it's real important. And I try to do it by example. I don't exclude people from the community if they don't check this box or that box. But yeah, I think I don't know. You wouldn't know. Neither of us are humanistic rabbis. Maybe next year we'll have a humanistic rabbi. I think the job of a rabbi is to lead by example in practice and in matters of faith. And so I think it's part of the business card of a rabbi to do that.
Erica, is there?
Hi, my name is Pauline. I have a question it seems that we're talking very much about the essence of who you are, both as rabbis and as people. So I'm asking the same question that a student once asked me, and that was out of the clear blue sky. So I'm going to ask you this question. I'm not a rabbi, but I managed to answer it. So the challenge is, the student said to me, what are the 3 guiding principles of your life?
I'm going to give them an excuse. Not an excuse, but if they can't come up with them right now, maybe they can tell you later.
No, I feel like that's a fair thing to
Okay.
discuss, so I'll take a stab. I think this would be better with a little more time to ponder it, because I have not ever been asked that question before, but I like it. I'm going to try to make it as Jewy or rabbi-y as I can. So I'm going to use a few principles. So I think one is the recognition of everything being created in the image of God, the belief that there is sanctity in everything that is around us. I think the second is the idea that we are here, I am here, we are here collectively to move the world towards what it ought to be reaching towards a dream. And the third thing is that we can only get there when we recognize that we are doing so together. We can't do it alone. Those would be the 3 guiding principles, I think, that shape my life.
Pretty good on one foot.
Yeah, I was going to say those are great principles, and all the more so unscripted. I would just stick with one. I think the beginning and end of any theological, humanistic, personal conversation is the idea that each and every one of us are created equally in the image of God, and thus to be accorded infinite dignity. I think that and a cup of coffee gets me through the day.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you all. Thank you so much.